weapons systems and the Middle East peace process. The Center for Policy Analysis on Palestine is hosting this
event in our luncheon speaking program. Today we are fortunate to have an activist and an author, John Steinbach, who will speak on Israeli weapons of mass destruction, a threat to peace, ? Mr. Steinbach, author and activist, is a veteran of the U.S. Coast Guard and graduate of the University of Michigan School of Natural Resources and the Environment. He is presently co-convener of the Gray Panthers of Metro Washington and serves on the board of directors of the Martin Luther King Jr. D.C. Support Group. He is also secretary of the Hiroshima-Nagasaki Peace Committee of the National Capital Area. The author of numerous articles on environment, nuclear, Native American, human rights, and national security issues. Mr. Steinbach has been an activist in the peace and justice movement for over 30 years. He is the co-author of the report and database entitled Deadly Nuclear Radiation Hazards, USA, a comprehensive listing of over 6,500 contaminated and potentially contaminated nuclear sites in the United States. His most recent articles are entitled Israel's Weapon of Mass Destruction, appeared in Covert Action Quarterly, April-June of 2001. He also wrote an article entitled Palestine in the Crosshairs, U.S. Policy and the Struggle for Nationhood, also in Covert Action Quarterly. And his most recent article is Nuclear Nightmares, Redux, the Bush Administration and the U.S. Nuclear War Fighting Policy, which was published by the Center for Research on Globalization. Mr. Steinbach and his wife, Louise Franklin Ramirez, also a noted researcher and author, make their home in Manassas, Virginia. Please welcome Mr. John Steinbach.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'd like to take this opportunity to thank the Palestine Center for inviting me to be here. And I wanted to start my talk by telling you all about how I came to write this article. I've been an activist for 30 years, and a large part of my activism has been on the issue of nuclear weapons and nuclear power. And I want to get it right up front that I am an opponent of nuclear weapons and nuclear power and an activist. So in that sense, I'm not an academic researcher. I definitely have an agenda. So I wanted to get that out there. One of the issues that I've worked on for a number of years is the issue of Mordechai Vanunu. And some of you may be familiar with him. He is an Israeli whistleblower who worked in the Dimona nuclear plant. And in 1986, he took photographs of the plant and gave them to the Sunday London Times, where they were published, analyzed and published. These were detailed photographs. They were examined by the nuclear experts, and it was determined from those photographs that Israel potentially possessed an arsenal as large as 200 nuclear weapons. But more importantly, the evidence that Vanunu released showed that the Israeli nuclear weapons program was vastly, vastly more far advanced than anyone, including the CIA, believed. And that included thermonuclear weapons and miniaturized weapons. Vanunu went to London during the publication, was interviewed. While he was there, he was seduced by a Mossad Matahari, a spy from the United States, from Florida, who convinced him that the place where he would be safest was at her sister's house in Rome. So she talked him into going to Rome, where he was captured, beaten, drugged by the Israeli Secret Service, put on a yacht and taken to Israel, and then tried before a secret Israeli security court where he was not able to confront his accusers or the evidence, and was sentenced to 18 years in prison for treason. He served 11 of those years in solitary confinement. According to Amnesty International, one of the longest confinements in solitary known. He was then released into the general population for about a year, was not allowed to fraternize with Arab prisoners, then was sent back in for a brief time. He's back out in the general population now and is scheduled to be released in 2 years. But it is very possible that when he is released, he will not be permitted to leave Israel. And if he talks about this issue, he will be reincarcerated. And we owe a great debt to Mordecai Vanunu because we wouldn't know the information we know now if it weren't for his expose in 1986. It's because of him that people like Seymour Hersh wrote the Sampson option, which is the most comprehensive. It was written in the early 90s. And for folks who really want a comprehensive overview, I'd highly recommend the Sampson option. It certainly was a great help to me in putting together my paper. The Israeli nuclear bomb project goes all the way back to the beginnings of Israel, even before, back to 1948, when it was an idea of David Ben-Gurion, the first prime minister. Ernst David Bergman was a famous chemist, and it was his scientific impetus that gave rise to the actual creation of the Israeli Atomic Energy Agency, the purpose of which was twofold. One was nuclear power for electrical generation and also for security and for defense. The actual program didn't really start until the mid-1950s. And it was during that time that, particularly leading up to the Suez confrontation in 1956, that Israel developed a very strong, intimate ties with the French nuclear weapons establishment. So from the beginning of the French bomb, the Israeli scientists were heavily involved in building the reactors and building the infrastructure, and then later on in developing the bomb. And so when France exploded its first nuclear weapons test in Algeria, Israeli scientists were there and had full access to the French nuclear weapons testing data. There's lots of controversy about whether Israel actually ever tested a bomb. It's speculation that they may have in the Negev, but the point is it really wasn't necessary because for all practical purposes, the French tests were also Israeli tests. And we now know, after the fact from Israeli sources, that the bomb test that was discovered in the late 1970s off the coast of South Africa was actually a joint South Africa-Israeli test, part of 3 tests of miniaturized artillery shells of Israeli design. So Israel had a great deal of help, not only from France, but from the United States. In the mid-50s, the U.S. gave Israel a small research reactor, which helped immeasurably in preparing the first generation of Israeli scientists. And this was very important because there were very few physicists in Israel at the time of its creation. Israel signed a contract with France in the late 50s and early 60s to basically build the infrastructure for its nuclear weapons program. The French built a reactor at Dimona in the Negev desert. This was a 24 megawatt reactor that was later expanded to as much as 150 megawatts, which makes it a pretty large reactor. It was billed as a research reactor for when it was exposed publicly in the early 60s, but in point of fact, it was clearly not a research reactor. It was not designed for electrical power generation. It was specifically designed for nuclear weapon production. The reactor went online somewhere between 1962 and 1964. According to Avner Cohen's book, Israel and the Bomb, which is a very excellent overview of the early history of the bomb, it went online in 1962. There was also a reprocessing plant for plutonium reprocessing, a chemical reprocessing plant that was built at the same time, and it went into operation perhaps in 1965. So at that point, Israel was basically in business. It had what it really needed to have, but it had one big major problem, and that problem was uranium. If you are a non-nuclear nation and do not belong to the International Atomic Energy Agency, as Israel was and is, you have to find another mechanism for getting your uranium. The way Israel dealt with that in the first place was to stage several commando raids in Britain and in France, and literally hijacked shipments of uranium. These were, and Seymour Hersh goes into this in quite a lot of detail in his book for those who are interested in a fuller exploration of this story. In the middle 1960s, the Israeli government, in collaboration with the West German government, staged a diversion of 200 tons of uranium oxide ore. It was known in Israel as the Plumbot affair, and actually became quite a major controversy and scandal. But the shipment was put on one ship and then transferred to another ship, then to another ship. But it's certain that this uranium went to Israel and went into the reactor, and then undoubtedly was reprocessed for nuclear weapons. But this still isn't enough for what Israel had planned to do. So it needed some better system, and the system it came up with was a partnership with apartheid South Africa. And it was a very complicated and complex partnership. You have to remember that back in the 60s, South Africa was a pariah state. And back in the 60s, to a great extent, Israel was also an international pariah state. And the two nations found that they had a lot in common. There were a number of high-level exchanges between the two countries. And the uranium deal was basically a quid pro quo. The South African government would supply the uranium. It would also supply investment money, gold. South Africa had a lot of money, so it could provide investment into the Israeli economic infrastructure, also most certainly the Israeli nuclear infrastructure. And in return, and also provided access to testing. So there were, in '76, there was an attempted test in the Kalahari Desert, which was discovered by the Soviet Union, and the United States and the Soviet Union put extreme pressure on South Africa and Israel not to do it, and they didn't do it. It was several years later, in 1979, that the U.S. spy satellite accidentally captured a nuclear explosion off the coast of South Africa in the Indian Ocean. And it took place during a major tropical storm. And it turned out that the only reason why we know about that today was that there was a temporary break in the cloud cover. And a nuclear explosion gives off a very typical signature. It's a sharp blast of light and energy followed by another one, a double blast, virtually impossible to mistake. And in fact, the U.S. Scientists were from Brookhaven and from Los Alamos were certain that this was a nuclear explosion, particularly those that had designed the system. The subject was very controversial. It was kicked upstairs by Carter to a white paper panel, and they basically came up with a non-conclusive conclusion. that we really don't know whether it was. It could have been a meteorite hitting it or something like this. The problem is that the U.S. deliberately withheld major significant information from the panel. Again, I would refer you to Seymour Hersh's book, The Samson Option, if you want to learn more about that, and several other books as well. So Israel's uranium problem was solved, its testing problem was solved, and Israel was in business. According to Avner Cohen, on the eve of the 1967 war, and I'm literally on the eve, 10 days before the 1967 war, the order went out to manufacture 2 crude atomic bombs that would be deliverable by airplane. So that was the beginning of the Israeli nuclear deterrent. It's clear reading the historical record that the early rationale for the Israeli bomb was what's known as the Samson option, hence the title of Seymour Hersh's book. And actually, Hersh intends, at least I believe intends the title of his book to be ironic, because he goes to quite extreme lengths to explain that, in fact, the purpose of Israeli nuclear weapons no longer is as a deterrence, or the Samson option, or the idea that if Israel were, jeopardized and under extreme threat, the survival of the nation at risk, that it might be forced to use nuclear weapons, and as a very last resort. Seymour Hersh and many other analysts say that's really no longer the case. And the reason is that after 1967, the Israeli nuclear weapons program really took off. Took off for a number of reasons. Number one is the learning curve is a pretty steep learning curve. So you had a large number of very highly trained Israeli scientists, many of whom were trained in the U.S. at U.S. universities, many of who got their advanced training at the United States nuclear weapons laboratories, as well as nuclear weapons laboratories all over the world. There was close collaboration, and still is close collaboration, for example, between Israel and India. The Vanunu revelations blew the cover off the Israeli nuclear weapons program. Up until that point, it was well understood by virtually all knowledgeable observers that Israel was a nuclear power, but the expectation was they had several dozen bombs, and that the program was not advanced and developed, and that it was primarily for nuclear deterrence. With Vanunu's revelations, it became very obvious that was not the case anymore. And in fact, a number of authors have made the point, and I would refer to another paper by Warner D. Farr, as a lieutenant colonel in the Army. This is from the Counterproliferation Papers of the Air War College, a U.S. government college. He makes it clear that he's not speaking for the Air Force or the U.S. government. But in his extended article, which is titled "The Third Temple's Holy of Holies, Israel's Nuclear Weapons," he goes into great detail and over 100 footnotes talking about the nature of the modern Israeli nuclear weapons system. And he comes to the conclusion that Israel has as many as 400 nuclear weapons. Others, including Daniel Ellsberg, estimate that there may be as many as 500 nuclear weapons, but that's not really the point. I mean, some say that the lowest estimate that I've seen is 100 to 200, but that's not the point. The point is that if Farr is correct, Farr is not the only one. Certainly Hersh, Israel Shahak, many analysts totally agree on this, that the Israeli nuclear weapons arsenal is a very, very sophisticated arsenal, as sophisticated as the nuclear weapons arsenals of the U.S. or Russia. And in some ways, perhaps even more sophisticated, because one of the things that Israel began early on was a miniaturization program. Don't forget that Israel, according to the Vanunu photographs, Israel has the ability to make thermonuclear weapons, hydrogen weapons. And with that comes the ability to make very, very small weapons. People might remember the big controversy about 15 years ago when it was proposed that the U.S. developed the so-called neutron bomb, the so-called clean bomb that would kill people but leave buildings intact. It was a big controversy, and actually the controversy more or less scuttled the program. But there was no controversy in Israel because Israel's nuclear weapons program is, with the possible exception of China, is as guarded as any nuclear weapons program in the world. And there's tremendous, in Israel, there's tremendous debate about a lot of things. About the occupation, about Israeli war crimes, and so on. It's open. It's in the press every day. But there's one issue that is not open for discussion, and that is the issue of the Israeli nuclear weapons. Israel has a military censor. I don't know how many of you are aware of this. And that censor basically reads all potentially sensitive materials. And for example, they held up Avner Cohen's book, Israel and the Bomb, the early history of the Israeli bomb. And he basically ended his book with the '67 war. He covered the first 20 years. And they prevented the publication of that book for a very long time. And then when finally he said, well, you know, the heck with you, I'm a U.S. citizen. He has dual U.S.-Israeli citizenship. I'm going to, publish it in the United States. They threatened him with jail time. And in fact, one of the early pioneers, a general in the Israeli nuclear program, just a few months ago, was tried and convicted because he wrote a novel about his experiences. He tried to get around the censor by writing a novel. They refused to permit it, and he published it, and he was given a 2-year suspended sentence, but found guilty. This is one of their heroic generals. So the point is that the Israeli nuclear weapons program has never been open for debate in Israel itself. This is changing a little bit, but really only around the edges. So Israel has the neutron bomb. It has miniature bombs. It's developing even smaller micro bombs, very, very small bombs, smaller than anything that the U.S. or Russia has, and clean bombs. And of course, the reason for that is that these weapons are designed for nuclear war fighting. And if we're talking about nuclear war fighting in the Middle East, we're talking about a very small geographic area. Not like the United States with a continent, or Russia with a continent, or the ICBMs. We're talking about, being able to drive from Tel Aviv to Damascus in 6 hours, something like that. So if you're going to use nuclear weapons, you have to be aware that the winds can change and they could blow back and jeopardize you. So Israel has a very advanced bombs, and it also has a very advanced delivery system. There's a couple of new pieces of information that are not in my article I wanted to talk about briefly. People may have noted that in late June, Israel launched the OFEC-5 spy satellite. This is a 1,000-pound satellite that was launched into a high 400-mile orbit to give high-resolution photographs of the Middle East area. This is a big payload. It was launched west against the rotation of the Earth. That requires more thrust than if you were to launch it with the rotation of the Earth. The Israeli nuclear establishment, with great pride, said in Haaretz that this gives the Israeli government the ability to deliver a payload, and I would read that a nuclear payload. I mean, what other kind of payload would there be to any point on the Earth? The Pentagon was a little bit less optimistic, shall we say, and they estimated that the range of the Shavit missile, which is a modified Jericho 2 missile, is about 7,200 kilometers, which is 4,500 to 5,000 miles. The point of that is that makes Israel the possessor of a full-blown ICBM with a full range. It can nearly reach, if not reach, the coast of the U.S., and certainly reach far beyond Moscow. That's one new development that is of concern. I mean, it means that Israel has leapfrogged ahead of France, if not in terms of numbers of missiles, in terms of ability to deliver missiles, and leapfrogged ahead of China. I would make the argument that makes Israel the third most powerful nuclear power on Earth. I don't want to quibble about numbers of weapons. We really don't know. We really don't know how many weapons China has. China has about 400. France has about 400. Israel has anywhere from 100 to 500. One thing I can tell you definitively is that Israel's nuclear weapons program is advanced beyond the Chinese program and is basically a clone of the French program. And I have no doubt has exceeded its parent in its deadliness. The other point that I wanted to bring up, new point I touched on briefly in my original article, are the 3 Dolphin-class submarines that were purchased from Germany. This happened in the late 1900s. These were brand new submarines that were essentially given by Germany to Israel, partly in reparations for the Holocaust. These are diesel-fueled submarines, but make no mistake, these are among the most, if not the most advanced diesel submarines in the world. They can run on diesel power, they can run on batteries, they're quite large, and they were modified apparently directly in collaboration with the West German government to be able to accept cruise missiles. So each of the new Dolphin submarines deploys 4 cruise missiles. There was a test done in the year 2000, and the successful test reached 1,000 miles. The plans are that at least one of those submarines will be at sea at all times. The operational plans are, generally speaking, there will be 2 out at all times whenever possible, one in the Mediterranean, one in the Red Sea. The potential places for them to do port calls and that kind of stuff, Oman is one possibility. The other possibility, in my estimation, or possibilities, in my estimation, more likely than Oman because of geopolitics, would be India and Sri Lanka. Israel has very good relations with both. Israel particularly has good relations with Sri Lanka because it's been heavily involved in assisting Sri Lanka in the war against the Tamil separatists. So this, and Israel's point is, and it's a point that we should take into consideration, is that this provides Israel with a true second strike capability, and kind of an ultimate deterrence. And this begs the question of what is the purpose of Israel's possessing such a sophisticated, such a large and such a sophisticated nuclear arsenal? I really don't call into question the motives of the early Israelis in building the bomb for deterrent purposes. Certainly, prior to 1967, Israel's strategic position was less secure than it is today. But since 1967, the U.S. has given tremendous economic assistance. And in fact, Israel Shahak points out that one of the main purposes, in his estimation, of the Israeli nuclear arsenal is as a bargaining chip to coerce the U.S., among others. That it has been used in order to dictate events to its own liking in the Middle East. One example that I gave in my article is the 1982 invasion of Beirut. And don't forget, 20,000 people were killed in that invasion, mostly civilians, resembling in many ways the current situation. Of course, much bloodier, but on the ground, many of the same tactics used. And this went on for a long time, let's not forget, 4 months maybe. And it included the destruction of much of Beirut. I mean, I certainly will never forget the news footage of the destruction of Beirut during that summer. And the destruction of the Syrian Air Force on the ground. We're talking about some very, very aggressive actions on the part of Israel. And at least part of the reason why Israel, in my estimation again, why Israel was able to get away with this was the fact that they had the nuclear bomb. And I can tell you that the Arab states are terrified of this, and terrified that Israel might use that bomb. And I think most objective observers believe that if push comes to shove, that Israel would use it. And there are a number of scenarios, according to Israeli doctrine, that they would use it. In the event of a major conventional defeat, they would use it. If the Arabs used, quote, non-conventional weapons, they would use it. And in fact, the use of non-conventional weapons includes using missiles of any kind. So if missiles are launched against Israel, then Israel considers that to be a non-conventional attack and reserves the right to respond with non-conventional weapons, which in the Israeli jargon generally means nuclear weapons. Although there certainly are many substantive reports that Israel possesses a very well-developed biological and chemical weapons capability. For folks that are interested in looking at the broader question of weapons of mass destruction in the Middle East, I would refer them to the Federation of American Scientists' excellent website on weapons of mass destruction. But getting back to the point of the U.S., when the 73 war broke out, people will remember that Israel's military situation was really quite desperate for a couple of days. And tensions were very, very much rising. And Israel went on a full nuclear alert. It had perhaps 24 nuclear bombs at the time. And it made the U.S. aware. And in fact, the Israeli ambassador called Henry Kissinger at 3 o'clock in the morning and had a talk with him and said, if you don't give us a massive airlift of weapons and diplomatic support right now, then we will feel prepared to use the nuclear bomb if we have to. Apparently, Kissinger and Nixon's strategy at the time was to let the Israelis dangle for a little while. And then to come to their aid, that they agreed that they were going to help Israel out. They were certainly not going to permit any major defeat by Israel, but they wanted to teach Israel a little lesson, so they were going to let it dangle. When they were given this threat, within 4 hours, Kissinger had met with Nixon, and literally within hours, a major airlift of weapons, of U.S. weapons, was begun to Israel. And it was actually initiated by Israeli cargo planes coming and picking up the weapons from Fort Bragg and other installations in the U.S. And then within a few days, the U.S. Armed Israel, and including virtually the entire U.S. arsenal that was stationed in Germany at the time. So this was a major help. And as people remember, things got very dicey. The tide of the battle turned. Israel overran the Egyptian lines. Things got very tense. The Soviet Union got involved. Israel went on a full-blown nuclear alert. The U.S. went on a full-blown nuclear alert. The Soviet Union then went on a full-blown nuclear alert. It's still, this many years later, 20 years later, it's still not clear exactly what happened. There are accusations that the Soviet Union had taken a ship to Cairo that was loaded with nuclear weapons. Not proven. Most analysts think probably not true. There's more speculation that the Soviets had 3 nuclear weapons stationed in Syria. Also speculation, perhaps a little more credible speculation. But regardless, and that's really not the point. The point is things were dicey. We were talking about a full major alert by the 2 superpowers, and Israel stayed on alert for 34 days during that time. And that brings us to the here and now, and then I'm going to open up the floor for questions, because there's a lot of areas that I really didn't cover. This is a very serious issue. It would take a full weekend conference to even begin to scratch the surface. But today, the situation in the Middle East is certainly no better than it's been in the last 50 years. Some would argue that it's as bad as it's ever been. I don't know if I'd go that far, but it's certainly not good. The military situation isn't good. And to make things worse, we are now living in the aftermath of 9/11. The U.S. Has made it abundantly clear as recently as yesterday in the New York Times. And we're talking every weekend, every week in the New York Times, Washington Post, LA Times, London Observer, London Independent, more and more information that the U.S. has made a decision for total war against Iraq, to topple the regime, apparently to assassinate or to kill Saddam Hussein, the leadership, and the rest of the leadership, to stage war crimes trials, similar to what's going on in The Hague right now with Milosevic. They're not getting a lot of support from the Arab countries, at least yet, although I certainly wouldn't underestimate the ability of the U.S. government to be able to use influence and bribes and threats, a la the 1991 war, to get at least significant parts of the Arab world, if not to go along, at least to leave it alone. If this war is carried out, this total war, things could get very dicey. Number one is Israel will have a role, and I suspect it'll be very similar to the role that was carried out in '81, when Israel was attacked by the Scud missiles. According to Israeli doctrine, Israel at that point should have launched its nuclear weapons against Iraq. It didn't, because the U.S. essentially ordered it not to. We cannot expect that that's going to happen again. If Iraq has a few Scuds left, and according to the New York Times, they may have a handful, or quote, a couple handfuls. But I would remind folks that these Scuds are now how old? 15 years old. They don't age well, let's put it that way. But there may be a couple of Scuds there. There may be some remnants of weapons of mass destruction. Scott Ritter, who was the chief weapons inspector, who was the bad boy who was in Saddam Hussein's face during the early 1990s, and constantly on TV, and the great hero, has been on the tube. He's going to be on Donahue. He was on Pacifica this morning, and saying that for all intents and purposes, there are no Iraqi weapons of mass destruction, or they are so diffuse and so destroyed that they would be totally ineffective. But let's, just for the sake of argument, let's say, well, maybe there are, some chemical weapons, some biological weapons around, maybe a Scud or two. If Saddam Hussein is facing certain death, the leadership are facing certain death or war crimes trials and life in prison at the best, what incentive do they have not to do whatever is in their power to, in desperation, exact their own revenge? I don't think too much. I hope that these people are not crazy people. But I must say that, having been a nuclear activist for 30 years, I don't believe that anybody who is involved in nuclear weapons and nuclear weapons planning and policy is really and truly sane, because these weapons are insane. So I'm very much concerned that many things could happen regarding the Israeli nuclear weapons, regarding the Pakistani and Indian nuclear weapons, regarding the overt threats that the Bush administration has made to use nuclear weapons in Iraq, and to use nuclear weapons against non-nuclear states. It's a very serious situation. The Israeli nuclear arsenal is the only nuclear arsenal in the Middle East. Of course, Pakistan has its own nukes, but Pakistan is really focused on India and not particularly focused on Israel, and there's no credible evidence that I've seen that Pakistan has much interest in Israel at all, to attack Israel or to turn its Pakistani bomb into the Islamic bomb. They call it that, but it's really the Pakistani bomb, and we're talking nationalism here. So let me just end my talk by saying that Israeli weapons of mass destruction vastly exceed the capability of all of the other states in the Middle East region combined. In my estimation, in my opinion, again, there's no rational argument that this system is designed for deterrence, and in fact, there's overwhelming evidence that it is designed for nuclear war fighting if fighting should break out. But in the meantime, what Shimon Peres called non-conventional compellence. He's learned well from the war planners here in the U.S. And as long as Israel maintains this overwhelming arsenal of weapons of mass destruction in the region, it creates a self-fulfilling dynamic which impels the other states in the region to develop their own arsenals of weapons of mass destruction, and perhaps in a misguided attempt, but certainly understandable, attempt to develop their own deterrence. And unless and until the world community seriously confronts Israel about its nuclear arsenal, I think that the chances for a just and lasting peace in the Middle East are very, very dim. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Steinbach. We have roughly 20 minutes left on the program, so we will open it up to questions. I'll take as soon as I see somebody. 1, 2, 3, 4. Please.
Considering what you said about Israel developing...
Speak louder, please.
Why is Israel developing an enduring second strike capability and the range of weapons that would allow it to strike so far? Is this in anticipation of some enemy outside the Middle East that is nuclear capable?
The question is why is Israel developing a second strike capability, and why are they developing the capability to launch intercontinental ballistic missiles? The answer is, according to Seymour Hersh, among many others, that during the 1970s and 1980s, Israel was not only concerned about deterrence against the Arab states, but also, and some would even argue, especially deterrence against the Soviet Union. So for many years now, Israel has had large parts of the Soviet Union within its range, including at the extreme edge of its range, Moscow. And in fact, if you look carefully at the Jonathan Pollard affair, who was the spy, the Israeli spy who was giving top secret information to the Israelis, much of the information that he was given concerned very, very ultra top secret nuclear targeting, the Pentagon's nuclear targeting information against the Soviet Union. Today, of course, it has 5 spy satellites. It doesn't really need that information anymore. Regarding the submarines, the Israeli argument is that this is the deterrence that they need to prevent a state in the region from launching nuclear weapons. I guess I can accept that, except it kind of begs the question about what country in the Middle East would be crazy enough to launch a nuclear missile or any weapon of mass destruction at Israel. Think about that.
Sir.
Do you see Israelis increasingly willing to use whatever means necessary to survive and win, including the collateral damage or even murder of civilians and non-combatants? And do you think Palestinians are encouraging or provoking this with their own reaction to murder-suicide bombings and acts of terror?
The question concerned the spiral of violence in the Middle East, and whether Israel is more likely to use extreme methods to in its strategies. I don't know about the answer to that. The conflict in the Middle East has been very bloody for a long time. I'll give you my opinion. And this is especially in the last couple years, but I could go back over the last 50 years and give a number of instances that Israel has a history of seeking peace on its terms. It has a lot, I mean, to be fair, it has a lot to do with the psychology of the Holocaust. You know, I mean, I probably would be paranoid too. But sometimes that paranoia, I'll call it what it is, you know, kind of goes beyond boundaries. So time and time again, you see Arab peace proposals or U.S. or international peace proposals. And then seemingly out of the sky, there's a provocation by Israel. I can think of 3 times in the last year, including just this last attack in Gaza, when apparently Hamas and Islamic Jihad were willing to negotiate a ceasefire. That's not an isolated case. So it doesn't really answer your question. I would say I don't have an answer.
Yes.
Could you repeat the Pentagon's estimate of the Shavit's range?
This is in Haaretz. This is in the June 26th edition, the English language edition of Haaretz. And the Pentagon's estimate of the Shavit's range is 7,200 kilometers, which translates into roughly 4,500 miles. And that makes it more or less a full-blown ICBM.
I see the Israeli situation as very obviously stated time and time again by people like Sharon and that wing of thought in Israel as one that reflects the Holocaust, reflects the lack of faith in anyone coming to their aid, even though they depend on the U.S. enormously. And their theme is never again, and we'll do it ourselves, and we don't want to depend on anyone else. So I can see why the bomb has been developed. I don't see any way of countering that save through strong U.S. intervention. The only hope I see is that in the military establishment here, at the working level, there is a lot of anger, particularly over things like the Pollard spy case. Military people see Israel as having taken advantage of the United States. Is there any way we can build on that to bring lawmakers to recognize this threat?
Well, that's a pretty good question. Certainly what you say is true. There are many Pentagon analysts. Here's one right here who's very skeptical about the Israeli nuclear program and why so many, why so large. Israel now has submarines which are literally impregnable. Probably the only country in the world that could destroy the Israeli submarines is the U.S. If it wanted to devote the energies to it, could. Certainly no one else could. Certainly the Arab states couldn't. So there's no rational reason for Israel to have any nuclear weapons right now, except for the 12 that it has deployed on the submarines. In terms of influence, I think that certainly the nuclear issue is now starting to be addressed in Israel itself, and starting to be addressed among some of the activists working on peace and justice in the Middle East. It's still more or less a taboo subject both in Israel and here. But just the very fact that people are raising questions and the fact that the international climate is changing. There's a virtually universal international consensus that peace in the Middle East is going to involve Israel withdrawing at least roughly to the 1967 borders and Palestine establishing a true and viable state with control of its borders and its resources, with some type of compromise on Jerusalem, probably some type of a compromise on the right of return, although that's very difficult because that gets into areas of international law and inviolate rights. So I think we shouldn't be pessimistic. I think we should still try to be optimistic.
So.
I hate to follow my wife. They used to call the president of GE Neutron Jack. They used to call the president of General Electric neutron jack, because when he went into a factory, all of the jobs disappeared. Now, I'd like to know what happens with the neutron bomb, and can it be used against targets such as the Palestinian cities without destroying them. It would destroy all the people, of course. Secondly, proliferation. Do you think that the nuclear blackmail is being exercised now by Israel to partly explain the actions of the President of the United States in the past 6 months, where he says now and Sharon ignores it?
Repeat that.
Yes, the questions. First question had to do with what is a neutron bomb and could it be used against the Palestinian cities. The second had to do with Israel using its nuclear weapons as a mechanism of political coercion and whether that's had an influence on the Bush administration. Well, let me answer the neutron bomb question. The neutron bomb is basically a specifically designed small thermonuclear bomb or fusion-boosted device using hydrogen and deuterium to create a fusion explosion and minimizing the amount of plutonium in the bomb. It's really the plutonium that creates the dirty bomb effect, the various radionuclides that cause the fallout that we saw in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, for example, or that affected the atomic veterans and the downwinders. And that's one of the big drawbacks of using nuclear weapons, is because you have that effect. The idea of the neutron bomb is to minimize the plutonium, to maximize the thermonuclear bang, the bang from the deuterium and the hydrogen and the tritium. And what happens is that instead of the dirty radioactivity, you have massive amounts of gamma radiation and neutron radiation that are released. And this is very, very high energy radiation that penetrates walls, penetrates shields, and so on. So if you minimize the blast, you maximize the high energy radiation, non-particulate. But the waves, the energy waves of very high energy, you can theoretically kill lots and lots of people with a minimal amount of radiation and significantly lessen the so-called structural damage. And the answer as to whether that could be used against the Palestinian cities or cities in the Middle East, that's the whole point. I mean, they called them, that was the whole argument. In fact, that was what defeated the neutron bomb in the U.S. was that argument. The other question regarding the Bush administration and to what degree Israel's nuclear compellence affects U.S. policy day to day. I'm not sure that it affects it that much directly day to day, but certainly it's in the back of U.S., especially the senior planners and the ones that go back, the ones that remember 1983. It's in their minds. I don't know how much it directly affects. I will say, however, that if and when the U.S. goes to total war against Iraq, that Israel will have certain functions, and that will involve their nuclear weapons. The most obvious one is that Israel will be there to signal to the Arab states that you'd better not get involved. If you get involved in defense of Iraq, don't forget, we've got these weapons. There are other things too. The Mossad, the Israeli Secret Service, has very good intelligence in all the Arab states. I guarantee you that. So that'll be another factor. But I'm not sure about day to day. I think that's a good question. It's something to think about.
Peter.
A double question. The first is, in your research, did you consult Gordon Thomas' book and the section, Gordon Thomas's book called The Secret History of the Mossad? It was called Gideon's Spies, because there's a major part on the uranium transfer from the United States to Israel and France and Vanunu and so on. And what is your judgment on this? My second question is quite different.
Well, Now, the question had to do, did I read this particular book? I did not use that book. I'm aware of it. I did not use it in my research. The reference was to the Apollo affair, or otherwise known as the NUMEC affair. And this had to do with a company in Apollo, Pennsylvania. It was owned by an ardent Zionist who made frequent trips to Israel. And it had a very, very top secret contract with the U.S. government to build fuel rods for the Department of Energy reactors using highly enriched uranium, and uranium enriched to 90% uranium-235, which is the type of uranium used in a bomb. In the accusation that was made by the CIA, members of the CIA and members of the FBI, and I will say these people to this day believe that they are correct. The accusation was that between the late 50s, early 60s, as much as 200 pounds of highly enriched, 90% enriched uranium was diverted to Israel. There's no real smoking gun. There's a lot of investigation, some speculation, a certain amount of circumstantial evidence. The conclusions are not universal. For example, Seymour Hersh looks at it. He spends a half a chapter looking at it. He comes to the conclusion that it never happened. And he bases his argument on the fact that when the plant was dismantled in the 1980s, that approximately 100 or 150 pounds of enriched uranium was found in the air ducts and so on. And so he thinks that's what happened to it. Others, including former members of the CIA and FBI, stick by their guns, say that it did happen. But there's an important point here, and that is it really doesn't matter, because 200 pounds of highly enriched uranium is only enough to build, 15 or 20 bombs. And at the very most, it would have tided Israel over and enabled them to build weapons in the 60s. More quickly than they could have otherwise. But once Dimona was up and operating, it was largely irrelevant. And the South African connection was established.
Sir. In a book written by Michael Piper called The Final Judgment, he discussed that President John Kennedy opposed the nuclear program, the Israeli nuclear program. That made the Israelis angry at him, and actually he believes that the Mossad orchestrated through different channels to the assassination of President Kennedy. Now my question is this. If this is true, how do the lawmakers in this country feel about the extent of the power of the Israeli Mossad, or in other words, they have two choices, either to be elected and be happy campers, or be destroyed. If you have any remark on that.
Well, I've never read the book, and I can tell you that, the question had to do with Kennedy's opposition to the Israeli nuclear program. And certainly that's true. And Eisenhower as well opposed it. They didn't oppose it really, really vigorously. They made arrangements that Israel was very capable of circumventing. For example, when Israel bought the control board for the Dimona plant, they actually bought 3. They bought them from the U.S., by the way. This is one area where the U.S. was invaluable, was selling the hardware for the nuclear plant, some of the electronic hardware, Kryton switches that are used for thermonuclear weapons, and so on. But Israel bought 3 control panels for the Dimona reactor, and they built a phony baloney control room on the ground floor. And so the inspectors were brought in. They were showed the control room, and that this is the working reactor. And actually, it was totally phony. It had nothing to do with the reactor. The reactor was actually built down into the ground, 5 stories down, and the analysts were fooled, and to a great extent the CIA was fooled. Regarding the power of Mossad, I certainly think the Mossad is very capable, but I would say that probably we've learned that virtually all of these secret agencies are maybe not quite as powerful as they think. Regarding the influence of of the Israeli lobby and the ability to intimidate lawmakers, I think it's very real. There's a number of lawmakers that have been targeted and have gone down to defeat. Hilliard just went down to defeat. Cynthia McKinney is being targeted. But apparently what's happening now is there's a backlash, and a number of progressive Jewish citizens are coming to Cynthia's defense. So, good point.
Last question. Yes, sir.
Yes, how would you respond to the contention that Israel needs to have such a large arsenal of nuclear weapons based on the number of hostile countries surrounding it, based on the rhetoric that's still out there that they wish to destroy Israel, based on the sheer number of hostile cities? I mean, you mentioned that they have such a large amount of nuclear weapons to essentially fight a small enemy. But if you think about it, I mean, in the Arab world is such a large place. They have these nuclear submarine, or these submarines that you're talking about. You say that really no country but the United States can destroy them. Wouldn't, if you were in Israel's shoes, wouldn't you want to have that security and that have that potential of maybe having some submarines being destroyed? Wouldn't you want to have that superiority, in light of hostility? And in light of that, you also mentioned how nobody would be crazy enough to launch a strike against Israel. But you have to look back no further than 91 with Saddam Hussein launching his missiles.
Sure. Well, the question is, the question points out that Israel is confronted by a number of hostile neighbors, and there are a number of cities and targets, and why shouldn't Israel have a large number of nuclear weapons so as to be able to target the diverse number of targets that are out there? I certainly don't argue at all that Israel has legitimate security concerns. The problem is that all states have security concerns, and particularly when we're talking about a region like the Middle East, where you have so many countries that are close together. If one's concerns outweigh another's concerns, then that establishes an imbalance. And the natural attempt is going to be to attempt by any means necessary to bring things back into balance. So, it's easy to say, well, the Arabs are a monolith, but, the Arabs really aren't a monolith. I mean, amongst themselves, there are differences. Israel has, reasonably good relations with a number of the Arab states, a number of the Gulf states, for example. And the problem is that, once these weapons of mass destruction are used, and granted, Iraq did fire those scuds against Israel, and Israel, according to their, own nuclear dogma, should have responded. And the only reason they didn't is the U.S. forbade them from doing it, and at least at that point, Israel said that they wouldn't do it. So they're, when we're talking about weapons of destruction, we're talking about craziness. I mean, you're right. They are crazy. And, of course, the problem is going to be if they're used, and I think particularly in the Middle East or in India and Pakistan, because we can't forget that. It's not the Middle East, but it's not that far off. Then basically we're talking about unimaginable catastrophe, not just for the region, but for the whole planet. So I'm going to end on that note.
Thank you. This brings to conclusion our program today. Please join me in thanking Mr. Steinbach for a very interesting talk. Thank you, sir.
I have some copies of my article up here. If anyone wants to get a copy, please see me. Okay, well, what is the evidence for your assertion that it's very much more? What is that based upon?